Something is happening inside churches. Not a scandal, not a theological debate, something quieter and far more dangerous. People aren't leaving because they suddenly hate God. They're leaving because the story no longer fits the world they actually live in. And here's the part nobody in church leadership wants to say out loud. The real crisis isn't disbelief, it's disconnection. A gap between the life people experience and the explanations they're given. And once you notice that gap, it never closes again. Today, we're going to dig into this unspoken shift. Why faith communities are shrinking, why sermons feel hollow, and why millions are walking out without a fight. But it all begins with the one truth almost no one dares admit. It doesn't start with rebellion, it starts with a question. People do not wake up and suddenly decide they are finished with religion. It never begins with defiance. It begins with something much smaller and much quieter. A moment you almost dismiss. A feeling you try to shake off. A thought that slips in during a sermon or a prayer and refuses to leave. Maybe it is a verse that does not align with the world you see every day. Maybe it is a rule that claims to be sacred, yet somehow produces more guilt than wisdom. Maybe it is that familiar pattern of praying for guidance or healing or clarity, only to meet the same unanswered silence you have tried for years to reinterpret as part of some larger plan. You tell yourself not to overthink it, that doubt is normal, that everyone struggles, and for a while, that works. But the question stays. It moves in quietly. It begins to repeat itself at inconvenient times. It grows roots, subtle but firm, and once it settles in, it becomes impossible not to notice the things around you that never bothered you before. You start catching the contradictions in teachings that claim to be perfect. You observe how the explanations always circle back to the same phrases that sound more like rehearsed defenses than real answers. You begin noticing how quickly discomfort fills the room when someone asks something honest rather than something safe. And then it hits you. It is not just that you asked a difficult question, it is that you were never meant to ask it in the first place. That realization lands heavier than any doctrine. Because if a belief is truly unshakable, why would a simple question threaten it? You look around and notice the silence in others, the way they edit themselves, the way they protect the illusion of certainty by refusing to voice their own doubts. And in that moment, you understand the truth that starts the entire unraveling. People are not quiet because they lack questions. They are quiet because they fear the consequences of answering them honestly. The world got louder, churches didn't. The world today is louder than it has ever been. Information pours in from every direction. News, data, documentaries, podcasts, entire libraries of human knowledge are accessible from a device in your pocket. You learn about galaxies forming billions of light years away, about the chemical roots of emotion, about how trauma shapes the brain, about how species evolve over millions of years. Modern life forces you to confront complexity every single day. But when you step into many churches, the world suddenly feels frozen in time. The language, the explanations, even the worldview often speak as if the last 2,000 years never happened. Science advances, psychology deepens, history uncovers uncomfortable truths, yet the sermons remain almost identical to the ones preached long before electricity, medicine, or even basic literacy. The dissonance is impossible to ignore once you have heard the rest of the world speak. A young person goes to college and learns about cosmology, genetics, anthropology. They learn how planets form, how consciousness emerges, how societies rise and collapse. Then they come home for the holidays, sit in a wooden pew, and hear that natural disasters happen because people displeased a deity. They listen to explanations crafted in an era when storms were omens and illness was punishment. And something inside them quietly whispers that the world has grown far too large for that kind of thinking. The contrast becomes sharp enough to cut. You cannot live in a reality shaped by microscopes and satellites, and then be told that invisible spirits are responsible for every unexplained event. You cannot understand neurological disorders, and then be told they are the result of spiritual failure. You cannot see the vastness of the universe, and then pretend everything revolves around a single ancient text. People feel this mismatch long before they can articulate it. It sits in their chest like a pressure they cannot name. Something does not fit. Something does not add up. And once that realization settles in, the doubts multiply faster than any sermon can suppress. Certainty used to be comforting, now it feels controlling. There was a time when certainty felt like a gift. When life was harsh and unpredictable, people depended on leaders who claimed to know exactly how the world worked. For centuries, authority succeeded because people had limited choices, limited information, and almost no access to alternative explanations. A single voice could define morality, truth, purpose, and destiny. And there was comfort in that simplicity. A clear map, a clear hierarchy, a clear set of answers. But the world changed far faster than the institutions that claimed to guide it. Today, absolute certainty does not feel like safety anymore. It feels like a warning. In a world overflowing with knowledge, the person who insists they have every answer begins to look less like a teacher and more like someone protecting a fragile story. When a system demands total agreement, total obedience, total trust, people instinctively sense that something is being hidden behind that rigid confidence. They may not know what exactly, but they feel the pressure of it. This is where many churches have not kept pace. They continue to speak in absolutes in an age that values transparency. They insist on perfection in a time when people crave authenticity. They present every question as rebellion, every doubt as danger, every deviation as a threat to the entire structure. But the modern mind sees through that posture. When someone admits they do not know everything, you lean in. When someone pretends they know everything, you pull back. So the decision becomes painfully simple. You can stay for the comfort of certainty, embracing a world where every answer is pre-written and every question must be contained. Or you can step into the uncomfortable but liberating space where truth is not handed to you, but discovered, tested, and earned. And more people are choosing the path that allows them to breathe. They choose the path where curiosity is not punished. They choose the freedom of truth over the illusion of control. The moral monopoly is gone. There was a time when religion stood as the unquestioned judge of what was right and wrong. If the church approved of something, it became sacred. If it disapproved, it instantly carried the weight of sin. People did not simply believe these judgments. They built their entire sense of self around them. Morality was not a personal compass. It was a dictated instruction manual, handed down by an authority that claimed divine backing. For centuries, this structure worked because there was no real competition. Ordinary people could not travel far, read widely, or explore ideas beyond their immediate community. The church did not just guide moral behavior. It controlled the narrative about what morality even meant. And anything outside that narrative was framed as dangerous, corrupt, or evil. It created a world where goodness was inseparable from obedience and where virtue was tied to belonging. But then something deeply disruptive happened. People started meeting others outside their belief systems. They began working with them, studying with them, forming friendships with them. And slowly, they noticed a truth that the old structure was never built to withstand. Some of the most compassionate, honest, and selfless people they encountered had no religion at all. And equally shocking, some of the most judgmental, petty, and cruel individuals were the ones who never missed a service and proudly displayed their piety in public. The myth cracked, the monopoly collapsed. The idea that goodness belongs to one institution no longer holds any power. Once you have seen real kindness from someone with no doctrine behind it, you begin to recognize morality as something human, not something imposed. You understand that empathy does not require a text. Integrity does not require a ritual. Love does not require permission. And once a person sees that goodness exists everywhere, the spell breaks. You realize that being moral is a choice you make, not a rule you inherit. And when that door opens, it never closes again. Community isn't enough if it's conditional. Churches love to repeat the idea that people stay for community. They point to potlucks, small groups, shared prayers, familiar faces, and say that this is what keeps a congregation alive. And on the surface, that sounds true. Humans are social creatures. We want to belong. We want to feel seen. We want to feel like we matter to a group larger than ourselves. But beneath that comforting message lies an uncomfortable truth that many people only recognize once they try to fit in a little too closely. Community that is conditional is not community. It is a contract disguised as love. It is belonging that must be earned rather than offered freely. It is affection that only lasts as long as you agree to the right ideas, the right traditions, and the right identity. The expectations begin subtly. Believe what we believe, vote how we vote, speak the language of the group even when it does not match who you really are. At first, these demands seem small, just part of the culture. But over time, they tighten around you like a quiet pressure. You start to notice the moments when honesty feels dangerous, when sharing a real doubt or a real struggle earns you a gentle warning instead of support, when people listen, not to understand, but to correct. When the love you receive feels tied to your ability to stay inside the lines, and a part of you shrinks, because that is what conditional spaces require. You shrink the questions, you shrink the differences, you shrink the parts of yourself that do not fit the script, all to preserve a connection that begins to feel increasingly fragile. People crave connection, but only when that connection allows them to be whole. When it demands that they cut away pieces of themselves, the relationship stops feeling like community and starts feeling like control. And when someone finally realizes that, they rarely leave with anger. They leave quietly, peacefully, and with a clarity that does not fade. Because once you recognize that love with conditions is not love, you never willingly go back to it. Spirituality didn't die. It evolved. People did not stop searching for meaning. That part of human nature never disappears. What changed is the direction of the search. For generations, religion positioned itself as the single destination for every existential question. It defined purpose, identity, morality, origin, and destiny. If you wanted answers, you were told there was only one door to knock on. But when people stepped back and looked at the wider world, they realized that meaning was not confined to a single institution. It was everywhere, woven into experiences that existed long before any doctrine and continued long after people stepped outside it. Meditation offered stillness without fear. Philosophy offered clarity without dogma. Psychology offered healing without shame. Nature offered awe without rules. Stoicism offered strength without threats. Humanism offered compassion without conditions. One by one, these paths began lighting up in people's lives, not as replacements for religion, but as alternatives that felt more aligned with their inner world. Slowly, spirituality spread outward instead of upward. It decentralized. It stopped being a ladder with one correct direction and became a landscape full of possibilities. Religion had long insisted it was the exclusive path to truth. But when individuals explored these other avenues, they discovered something far more profound. Meaning was not scarce, it was abundant. It did not need a guardian. It did not need an interpreter. It did not need a gatekeeper standing at the entrance deciding who was worthy. Meaning was a human experience, not a religious product. It came from reflection, growth, relationships, creativity, struggle, and wonder. This shift is what many churches were not prepared for. They built their authority on the assumption that people needed them to understand life. But once people realized they could cultivate wisdom on their own, the structure of authority fractured. And when authority disperses, when people learn they can find depth and purpose without permission, it never fully returns. Hypocrisy isn't a surprise anymore. It's expected. There was a time when a church scandal felt like a lightning strike. People gasped, people defended, people struggled to understand how something sacred could fall so far from its own ideals. But that shock has faded. Today, when a new story breaks, when another leader is exposed, when another institution is caught violating the very values it preaches, the reaction is quieter. Not because people no longer care, but because they saw it coming. The element of surprise has vanished. People watch the sermons, and then they watch the behavior, and the two simply do not match. They hear messages of loving your neighbor, followed by behavior that excludes anyone who does not fit a narrow mold. They hear commands to help the poor, followed by budgets that prioritize buildings over people. They hear admonitions not to judge, followed by whispers, gossip, and moral policing that would make any outsider pause. Over time, the inconsistency becomes impossible to overlook. The problem is not that religious communities contain flawed people. Every group does. The problem is how often those flaws are covered up, excused, or ignored, while the same leaders demand purity from everyone else. When compassion is preached, but cruelty is practiced, when humility is praised, but arrogance is rewarded, when forgiveness is offered selectively rather than universally, people begin to recognize a pattern. The message is not failing, the leadership is. And trust erodes quickly in an environment where moral authority is claimed but rarely demonstrated. Once the gap between teaching and action becomes too wide, it creates a fracture that cannot be mended with apologies or public statements. People no longer believe that hypocrisy is an exception. They see it as part of the system itself, woven into its structure. And trust, once broken in that way, does not return simply because someone asks for it. It does not regenerate with rituals or prayers. When people learn to expect hypocrisy, they stop listening. And once they stop listening, they rarely come back. Fear stopped working. For most of human history, religion relied on fear to keep people loyal. Fear of sin, fear of punishment, fear of being watched by an invisible presence that recorded every mistake. Fear of an afterlife where one wrong choice meant eternal suffering. These ideas shaped behavior so deeply that questioning them felt dangerous. Fear was not just a tool, it was the foundation. It created obedience without debate, conformity without reflection, and silence without understanding. But something profound shifted in recent generations. People began to see the emotional cost of fear-based devotion. They began to notice how love that depends on terror is not really love at all. When you love someone because you are afraid not to, that love becomes a cage. It becomes performance. It becomes survival. And once someone recognizes that, the spell breaks. They start to ask the questions they never dared to ask. They start to examine the fear itself rather than the doctrine wrapped around it. When a person finally stops fearing divine consequences, their vision clears in ways that are almost impossible to describe. The threats lose their grip. The sermons that once felt heavy begin to sound hollow. The emotional pressure that used to hold them in place begins to loosen. It is not anger they feel. It is relief, because for the first time, they are not obeying out of terror. They are thinking for themselves. That first moment of clarity often feels like a slow, deep breath, the kind you did not realize you had been holding for years. You look around and see a world that was always larger than the rules that tried to contain it. You feel your mind expanding into the space that fear once occupied. And the freedom that follows is not chaotic or rebellious. It is calm. It is grounded. It is honest. That first breath of freedom does something no threat of hell ever could. It gives people a glimpse of what life feels like when their choices are not controlled by fear. And once someone has tasted that freedom, it outshines even the most beautiful promise of heaven. The real reason people leave, they outgrow the story. There is a truth almost no one inside religious institutions wants to admit. People do not leave because they suddenly lose faith or wake up one morning filled with rebellion. They leave because they grow. Growth is quiet. It is subtle. It happens in the private spaces of the mind where no sermon can reach. A person becomes more curious. They start asking questions that do not fit neatly into the old explanations. They become more compassionate, and that compassion begins to clash with doctrines that divide, condemn, or exclude. They become more aware of contradictions, both in the text and in the behavior of the people who claim to follow it. As they grow, something becomes clear. They want a worldview that evolves as fast as the world around them. They want ideas that expand rather than repeat. They want depth that deepens with experience, not rules frozen in time. Religion offers the same answers forever. Answers that once brought comfort now feel like walls. Answers that once felt profound now feel incomplete. Human beings change. Their understanding changes. Their moral clarity changes. Their capacity for empathy changes. But the religious framework remains still, insisting that it has already reached perfection. This mismatch creates a tension that cannot last forever. A person begins to feel the boundaries of the story pressing against their own development. What once fit them perfectly now feels tight and constricting, like a childhood coat that no longer matches the shape of who they have become. They try to adjust themselves, to shrink enough to stay comfortable. But authenticity refuses to be compressed indefinitely. And when the moment comes, they do not leave in outrage. They leave with understanding. They leave because the world outside the story feels larger, more honest, and more alive than the story itself. They leave because they realize something simple and undeniable. The story stopped growing, but they did not. So what does all this mean? Churches aren't collapsing because society is evil, or because people are lost, or because morality is dying. They're collapsing because humanity is maturing. We're learning to think for ourselves, to question authority, to value honesty over dogma, to seek meaning instead of memorizing beliefs. And here's the most liberating part. Leaving religion isn't the end of the journey, it's the beginning of owning your mind. If this video helped you see the shift more clearly, or made you question something you once accepted, then you're already on the path. Keep thinking, keep questioning, and if you value truth over tradition,